Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Flex Talks on supply chain resiliency in good times and bad. So last week, we covered strategies during the beginning months of the pandemic. That was covered by Lynn Terrell, our Chief Procurement Officer. Today, Eric Larson, who's the VP of Supply Chain Management at Flex, will cover long-term resiliency strategies and proactive risk management. So anytime, if you have questions, please do use the Q&A box at the bottom and write them in. And in about 20 minutes, our Senior Director of Supply Chain, Antonio Talia, will be noting them, and he'll be asking Eric the questions and having a conversation. So go ahead, Eric.
Thanks, Patty. Good morning, good evening, everybody. I hope you're doing well, your families are doing well, everybody's staying healthy during this time. Thanks for taking some time out of your schedules. We wanted to take a few minutes and build on what Lynn Terrell, our Chief Procurement Officer at Flex, shared last week. Lynn had done a deep dive into how we responded and reacted to the COVID crisis within Flex. And what we want to do today in this session is really talk about how Flex is trying to take that information and the learning that came out of the situation and apply them to future resiliency training. So again, we're going to look at the COVID-19 postmortem and supply chain analysis that we've done within Flex, and taking a look to see how we can proactively apply that to risk management. So Lynn last week had shared a little bit about the history of the event. Obviously, we all know that January 27th was kind of the initial announcement from the Chinese government saying that they were going to extend Chinese New Year and keep people home from work and from schools until February 9th. I don't think anybody had any idea exactly where that was going to go and what kind of impact that would have on our lives over the next 6 months and beyond. And so last week, Lynn had kind of covered exactly how we as Flex and the management team responded. And the top section is really just from a personnel perspective, how we pulled a cross-functional group together, a worldwide group. And we had daily executive calls with the teams and war rooms set up, and made sure that everybody was aligned on what the strategies were, what the issues were, staying up to date on everything that was happening and responding real time. And then down below, it's just the systems and tools perspective. You know, Flex is very strong in the systems and tools side of the business, and we felt that our systems and tools really gave us a competitive advantage in the way we could respond to the situation with real-time data and being able to respond to what was happening. So as far as resiliency goes, I think we've all lived it over the last 6 months, so we're all thinking about it and talking about it. But just to build on that a little bit, if you look at the procurement leaders report from last month, I believe, they did an interview with about 100 CPOs. And across those 100 CPOs, almost half of them said the number one thing they were looking to accelerate in their business was resiliency and risk management. And then 2/3 of them, 64% of them almost, were interested in taking steps to further manage and monitor suppliers' financial health. So really a focus shifting to supply chain resiliency. And you don't have to go much beyond a one-page Google search to see, just in August alone, Forbes, Deloitte, Harvard Business Review, and Boston Consulting Group all did white papers or articles or research on resiliency in the supply chain and how that is coming back up as a top topic within the industry. And so this is from McKinsey & Company. And you can see, again, this just reinforces why are we talking about resiliency all the time. Not only are some of the situations like COVID-19 having a significant impact on our business, but they're also seeming to be more common. And whether it's the trade wars that we've recently worked through, some of the hurricanes that we've had, or the floods, and most recently, obviously, COVID-19. And given the impact it had just on US GDP at 30%, unemployment and market cap, we felt this was a perfect opportunity to look at a big set of data and figure out exactly what were the strategies we use to mitigate, and then how do we do that proactively going forward. And so just real fast over health solutions within Flex, we really go after 3 marketplaces, and you'll see this reflected in the business and the information we share today. We do medical devices, so small mobile devices, personal handhelds. We do medical equipment, so very large equipment, things like hospital beds or ultrasound machines, and most recently ventilators. And then we also do a lot of pharma with auto injection and other devices. As a company, or as Flex Health Solutions, we have 150 different unique customer supply chains that we're managing. We have 4,000 suppliers, $1.5 billion of spend. We place approximately 40,000 POs every single month. And we have 100,000 active component SKUs, and it all goes through 17 different countries with 27 different sites. And then really more specifically into the COVID, what we're going to focus on from in the next two slides is this piece of the business. So we evaluated 50 new business opportunities during this time. We wanted to make sure that our resources went to the deals that had the most potential of having a positive impact on the world's needs. So we were very selective. We went through 50 of them. We ended up only really launching about a handful of them. We had 20 existing customers that had significant upsides, anywhere from 2x to 10x. And just as some examples, we launched 5 new ventilator programs in the last 4 to 6 months. Some of them as many as weeks. We had 4x increase in patient monitoring systems. We had a 5x increase in infusion pumps, a 10x increase in diagnostic kits, and a 3x increase in ICU beds. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at all that data, look at the shortages that occurred from those, and then look at the learnings from there. So this is just a progression of our shortages through time. So going back to February 1st, we had about 24 critical shortages. That's very, very normal in our business. We always have supply constraints that we're working through. And on that date, that January 27th date again, we had the announcement from the Chinese government that they were going to delay the return to work and school. And what you'll see is the next 4 to 5 weeks was really about factory shutdowns. So this was because of the extended factory shutdowns in China, because you might have a factory or a supplier where they had to shut down for an extended period of time because they had some actual cases of COVID in their factory. We started seeing these spot shortages all over the place. And so you see a slight increase going from about 25 shortages on average to about 200. So about an 8x increase. And then from there, what you really see is the hospitals and the medical industry looking and seeing what was happening in the cases that were spiking and realizing that we were going to need more patient monitors, we were going to need more beds, more ICU bags, and everything else. And so it took about 6 weeks to realize that. And then we got increases from a variety of customers over the next following 6 weeks. And come April 11th, we essentially had about 95% of all the increases from all the customers loaded in our system, and we were kind of off and running. Oh, I don't know how that happened. Okay. So again, we averaged about 40,000 POs a month. What you can see is a huge spike there in March and April. We went up to almost 80,000 POs in April alone, and it was across 19,000 unique items. And then what you'll see is we actually had 6,000 shortages. If you really look at right when we cut all the POs and all the needs that we had 6,000 parts in month that were not going to hit the dates. About 5,000 of those were able to be supplied by the existing suppliers, given our existing buffer programs and ordering strategies and all of that. And so what we're left with is those 900 critical shortages that took longer to go manage and figure out how we were going to go mitigate and recover. And so that's the next slide. We're going to go into these 900 shortages and look to see how we reduce that down to about the normal 50 range within just a few months. So again, same slide, just exploded a little bit. Again, the 900 shortages here coming down to about 50. We're looking at the weeks to resolve, the number of shortages we had in the first pie chart, and then approximately how many dollars it took to resolve those. This is the flex view of the world and what we saw from expenses on that. The dollars represent about $15 to $20 million in total expense. So in weeks 2 through 7, the focus was really on spot buys. So one of the fastest ways to resolve a shortage after you've not been able to get it from the supplier is to go out and look for the parts in the market. We resolved about 35% of our shortages in doing so. It was about 300 shortages. However, you can also see that it cost about 35% of the total recovery. It was roughly in the $7 to $9 million range in total premiums paid in order to execute those spot buys. Expedite fees. Typically what you'll think about in this space is PCBs. Typically the lead time is around 8 weeks, and you can see that with expedite fees, we were able to recover those within about 8 weeks. And it was about 15% premium that we saw coming out of that space. Expedited freight. So this is looking at mechanicals and other parts of your supply chain that you might have in a different region of the world. You might be sending those items via ocean, and for a period of time, because of the upside, you're having to send it air freight. And what you see there is it really took about 3 to 12 weeks to recover from those items, and it cost about 30% of the total premium that Flex was using and seeing from a recovery perspective in freight. Off AML approvals, this is an interesting one. It essentially costs nothing. Typically, and if maybe not nothing, but very, very minimal, typically other suppliers are very close in price. And so the issue is the timing of this. You work through the other 18,000 shortages and you get to the point where you realize you're not going to be able to resolve these. And so that's where the engineering resources get applied to be able to get other items approved. And when you get those, you're able to get those parts from market and fulfill the demands that you have. But the key is identifying which items you want to put the engineering resources into to going and resolving those. And so doing this proactively during design and during supply chain setup is obviously a very critical part of managing risk and mitigating risk. Executive relationships. One of the things we found in the 900 shortages we had was that there was a number of items that were in the 26 to even 52-week lead time. They were items that were in high demand across industry, within the medical industry and everything else. And it was one that they were going to be shared across the board. But because of our executive relationships with some of these suppliers and our customers' executive relationships, we were able to get those lead times down from the 20 plus weeks down to 7 to 12 weeks and actually see recovery in 7 to 12 weeks. So we were getting portions of the supply the entire time, and we were getting full recovery within 7 to 12 weeks. And again, that executive relationship, having a relationship with your partners and that ability to leverage it costs really nothing except for a phone call and the investment that you've put into those partners previously. Next was test and tooling capacity. So this is more about specific tooling and test capacity. So things like test fixtures for products, tooling for plastics or for metals. And what we saw was that there was about a $2 million premium that we put into various different tooling expenditures and expansions. And in this case, there's again a delay in that decision of investing in the capital while we try to assess whether or not the rest of the supply chain is going to make it and whether or not you want to put in the investment to that test and tooling capacity. And so you can see that delays out in the 9 to 14 week time frame. And then lastly, it's just the market capacity. This is only about 50 line items in total. And what's interesting about it is it's essentially allocations that are happening in the market. There is not enough capacity in the market, and it's going across multiple different customers. So you think about your core technology parts in this space, and you can see ultimately it takes the longest to recover. It doesn't cost you anything, but it's painful during that time. And so it's critical on these parts to have a strategy in place. Again, it's only a very, very small portion of your actual part number count, but it's just absolutely critical to understand those parts and make sure you have strategies in place for those parts to be able to have a resilient supply chain. So let's step back for a minute, look at all of those things that we're talking about and figure out how we apply that within the Flex Health Solutions area. So number one, Flex puts in place a strategic supply chain management manager on accounts. And the idea is that they're looking at the supply chain from the very beginning to the very end. We do not always engage in the concept phase, but we do have the ability to engage from concept all the way to the end of life. And we have those people in place in order to support that process. And so during concept, what we're looking at is we're looking at number one, doing a quantitative supplier selection. We're looking at the suppliers that are providing a certain technology. And through our weighted matrix, we're looking at their ability to be responsive, our relationship with them, the capacity, their competitiveness, their financial health, and their stability to make sure that we're selecting suppliers up front that are going to be there for the long term. And that's the first step in the process. After that, we're looking at the evolving risk report. So this is more looking at the strategy from a geographical perspective and making sure that we're set up in the way that our mechanicals, our PCBAs, our plastics are set up in a way that they provide resiliency, that they're near the end market, and that they're supporting the product in the way that we want to go support that product and the go-to-market strategy. From there, as we start to transition into ramp and scale, we're getting down to the component level and we're coming up with specific risk mitigation strategies for each part. So for sole source parts, that might be a buffer. It might be looking at getting dual sources on there, or it might be looking at splits. So you have multiple AMLs on the part, and so you might want to give two suppliers a share of that business to make sure that you have a pipeline in two different places coming. If one of them shuts down, you've already got something on the other side. And then you're obviously also looking at capacity, tooling, and all those other things. And then as we go into ramp, we have to build that into a plan. You've identified the risk. You've identified the items that you think are the high risk. Some mitigation strategies are going to be faster than others to implement. And so we build out a plan to make sure that we drive it over the long term, not just in the first 4 or 5 weeks, but also through the coming months and quarters and years. And then lastly, it's just the continuous management of it, looking to see if parts are becoming an EOL, if they're coming to a point where they're going to go obsolete and we need to get other suppliers on the AML. If we have tooling that's coming to a end of life where we might start to get quality issues from it and thus need to replace it, what engineering support we have. And it's a constant cycle of looking at the risk within the supply chain and making sure you adjust it. And I think one of the things I wanted to highlight is that in a situation like we just went through, you're obviously looking to respond to a situation. And I think what we want to do going forward is we want to see how we spent time and energy and money in responding to the situation, and then figure out how we apply our resources to doing that in the future to mitigate it. So things like having the right strategy for expedited freight, so that, you know, where we have things on the ocean, maybe weighing that a little heavier in our sourcing decisions up front and making sure that we avoid that in the future by maybe being regionalized in that case, or by sharing splits between suppliers so we have multiple suppliers sending in the same part, and those types of things, so that we're a little more proactive in the approach. So lastly, I stole this slide from Lynn again last week, made a slight change to it. Essentially, there's 3 pillars or areas that you look at when you're assessing risk. Number one, it's the customer, it's the product. It's what are you trying to fulfill? What is your go-to-market strategy? What are the key elements of your product and the parts within there that are the higher risk components? You take that information, then you go over and you look at your partners. As you have a higher risk component and maybe a partner that's a little higher risk, or maybe a higher risk from a quality perspective or a financial perspective, it weighs heavier. And then lastly, you look at the market risk. So those elements of the market that are going to come in, whether it's a flood, whether it's political issues with trade wars or those items, or whether it's something like the pandemic that we just recently dealt with. And then take those 3 things, and essentially where we want to see Flex at is we want to see Flex in the center of that. We believe that we are positioned well to mitigate risk throughout the entire supply chain. And we're taking the learnings from the last 6 months and trying to apply that to the way that we manage our supply chains going forward. So with that, I will close up. But I wanted to thank you again for taking the few minutes and going through this. I hope that it was helpful. I hope that it shared some good information about where, from a large supply chain perspective, from a very large event, provided some insight into where you can apply your resources going forward in order to mitigate your supply chain risk and your company's costs going forward, And if there's ever anything at all Flex can do to help, we would be glad to have those conversations and engage in those. So thank you for taking the time. And with that, I'll pass it over to Antonio for any questions.
Yes, Eric, thank you. We do have some questions from our audience. First question is, now that the big bubble has passed, what has been the impact on things like inventory, cost management, sustaining supply as you navigate the steady state?
Yeah, no, excellent question. So things have definitely shifted in the last little bit. So as I shared in the prior slide here, you can see that the shortages overall have recovered. So we're down in the 40 range in shortages. And those are really those last few critical items that we're working through. Some of the demand has dropped, obviously, and so there is now inventory in this space for sure. I think we're all watching and waiting to see where the supply chain is going to go, where the demand is going to go. Obviously, I think we're all hoping that there is not a second wave of COVID, and that there's not a need for another increase in demand there, and that instead we can kind of get back to a more normal rate, get inventory levels down to a more normal rate, and then really focus on taking the learnings of the issues we saw and applying them to our existing supply chain, which is really our focus going forward. As you know, Antonio, is taking these learnings, going through our actual existing customers on those specific exact parts, and trying to apply those into a future supply chain that makes them more resilient for future spikes in demand.
Thank you, Eric. There's another question that ties to the slide after this one. What was the value of the executive relationship leverage, and why did you wait a month to use them?
Yeah, so I would not say, number one, that we waited a month to use them. I would say that, you know, again, if you go back to the slide about the shortages here, our stocking strategies, our order strategies, our ABC classifications, SMI, everything else, we had 19,000 unique items. And we had, on day one, once we cut the orders over, we had roughly 6,000 that did not meet the dates. We were able to resolve 5,000 of those in that same 2-3 week time frame, right? So we were able to leverage those suppliers and resolve those. What we were left with was the 900 items that were absolutely just the critical items that we knew were going to take a while to recover from. And I think what I would say about the executive relationships here is that these are items that had lead times between 20 weeks all the way up to like 52 weeks, and in some cases even beyond that, because the demand was so high. And so what we were able to do is we were able to continue to get parts, but actually completely resolve those shortages. This is the point where we resolved the entire shortage within 7 to 12 weeks by using those executive relationships that we and our customers have. And so it was one of those where it was a significant improvement, and we were able to pull those dates in.
Thank you. And have we actually been able to operationalize any of these changes, any of these great things we've done? I know it's easy to say, it's hard to do, right?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a number of examples of that. Honestly, even during the COVID case, we were able to shift supply chains around, and we were able to make significant changes in the supply chain in a very, very short period of time. So we had examples where we moved tooling within a week and a half. We had situations where we had to approve parts and test parts. We had one product where we went through 3 different tier 2 parts. They had to go into our supplier, and then they had to go into Flex for testing. And we actually had to go through 3 different tier 3 part going into tier 2, going to us. And we were able to do that within about a week and get approval on the 3rd item. Actually, the first 2 went through, did not pass. The 3rd one went through. We were able to do some of those things to actually make significant changes in very, very quick time frames. And so we're looking to do that proactively going forward.
Thank you. And one last question, Eric. Do you feel there was something that could have done better, we could have improved or we will be able to improve next time?
It's an excellent question. I think number one, it's taking what we've already done, which is looking at the data and understanding that, you know, for an example like freight, it was only 50 items that caused the $4 million in freight. It was not a huge count of parts. And so it's an eye opener to really understanding our supply chain and really working with our customers to understand what they want to do with their supply chain, and then applying that knowledge specifically to those products so that we come up with the best supply chain from a cost perspective, but also from a resiliency perspective. And so in doing that, I think number one, taking and looking at the data, understanding what we can learn from it. Number two, applying that to our existing products that we have. And then number three, building that into future products with during concept and development and ramp. And so that's what we were really hoping to do today, was just share some of those learnings that we saw and realize that sometimes the cost of being able to mitigate a supply chain is actually very, very small if you have the right relationships. And then other times it's very, very large if you don't have dual source parts, or you don't have relationships with key suppliers, or you don't have mitigation strategies in play. So we want to make sure that we take that and apply that to all of our partnerships going forward.
Thank you, Eric. There's no other questions so far.
Okay, so with that, I will just want to say thank you for taking some time to spend with us today. I hope it was helpful, and I hope there was some information that will help you set your supply chains up in the future. Maybe some things to think about. If there's any way at all we can help, or if there's things that we can do to work together on, please let us know. Thanks again for your time. And with that, I'll pass it over to Patty.
Thanks, Eric, and thank you, Antonio, for a great discussion. And thanks to all the attendees who were here. You will receive a recording of this as well. If you're interested in last week's part 1 discussion by Lynn Terrell, I'll be happy to send that recording. And you will also receive an invite to our next Flex Talks, another hot topic, which is going to be on cybersecurity for connected medical devices. So you will receive that link as well. Thanks, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of your day or evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.